run this community, not you!
Then you'll drown with your authority.
Her voice sliced through the ocean wind like a blade. Remove that barrier by tomorrow, Mr. Holloway, or the board will fine you daily. Celeste Marrow stood with her arms crossed, crimson blazer gleaming against the pale seawall that separated our properties from the Atlantic. The clipboard in her hand wasn't just for notes, it was her weapon, polished and precise. She'd already written something down before I could answer. "You're writing a fine before I even speak?" I asked. "The board doesn't need speeches, Grant," the clipboard queen replied smoothly. "We need compliance." But she wasn't ready for what came next. "I designed that wall," I said quietly, letting the words hang. "Every bolt, every brace, every cubic yard of concrete. And it's failing, not because of me, but because your last inspection was falsified." Her pen froze midair. For the first time, her eyes flicked down to the hairline cracks running along the concrete seam. They traced across the wall like lightning scars, reaching toward her manicured shoes. If you've ever had that moment when the bully across from you realizes you know more than they do, lean in and hit the subscribe button right now. Because what happened next turned a neighborly warning into a war that drowned a community. The enforcer in crimson recovered fast. "You're not a certified inspector anymore, are you?" she shot back. "So this conversation is over." "Wrong," I said. "I'm a structural engineer with 20 years' experience, and the next storm will turn this entire bluff into soup if you keep ignoring the pressure points." She smirked, stepping closer. "You always talk like the sky's falling, Grant. Maybe that's why nobody listens." It would have been easy to shout to match her arrogance. But I didn't. I looked past her instead, toward the horizon where waves rolled against the seawall my father and I once reinforced together. That wall was more than concrete. It was legacy. My father used to say, "If you build something to stand against the tide, make sure truth is the first layer you pour." That truth was eroding fast. The officer of rules tapped her clipboard again. "If you keep spreading panic about this wall, we'll consider it defamation against the HOA." "You mean defamation against denial," I said, keeping my tone calm, "because the next high tide doesn't care about your minutes or your bylaws." That hit her harder than I expected. Her lips pressed into a tight line. Behind her, 2 other board members shifted awkwardly, pretending to check their phones. Even they could feel the unease humming beneath the bluff. This wasn't about fines or fences anymore. It was about truth versus image. And Celeste Marrow's image ruled Seacliff Point Estates. The wind picked up, flinging spray across her blazer. She brushed it off with irritation, glaring at the waves as if they too had violated HOA policy. "We'll handle the matter internally," she said. "Like you handled the drainage collapse last year?" I asked. Her eyes snapped back to me. "That was different." "Yeah," I said. "That one only cost 3 families their backyards." The clipboard queen turned sharply and started walking toward her SUV, heels stabbing the boardwalk. "You'll hear from our counsel," she called over her shoulder. I watched her drive off, taillights cutting through the mist. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the familiar ache of warning people who refused to listen. The wall groaned under a fresh wave, and I could feel it, the deep vibration of stress rippling through steel supports that should have been replaced years ago. They laugh, they mock, they double down. But I didn't build my father's seawall to watch it crumble under pride, not hers, not mine. So I went home, opened my laptop, and pulled up every inspection file since 2016. I didn't know it yet, but buried inside those PDFs was the first hairline fracture in her empire. Because when truth meets water, one always finds the leak. Subject, cease and desist, false statements about structural integrity. Signed by Celeste Marrow, naturally. The board chair had wasted no time escalating her performance. I opened the attachment expecting standard legal fluff, but what I read made me sit back in disbelief. She'd accused me of spreading misinformation, defaming the HOA's professional standards, and creating unnecessary panic. In other words, she was declaring war in print. The enforcer in crimson wasn't just trying to silence me, she was trying to rewrite the narrative before the truth surfaced. And in a place like Seacliff Point Estates, appearances were the only foundation that mattered. I stepped outside to clear my head. Across the cul-de-sac, Celeste's SUV gleamed like a scarlet threat beneath the sun. She was standing with two board members, their expressions rehearsed, their posture sharp. Even from a distance, I could see her gesturing toward my home, clipboard in hand, her weapon of choice. That's when I noticed my neighbor, Hannah Brooks, watering her plants but watching the exchange through the leaves. Hannah was the board's treasurer, a conflicted ally trapped in the orbit of Celeste's authority. Our eyes met for a second. She looked away fast, the way someone does when guilt begins to outweigh fear. The clipboard queen pointed toward the seawall again. The way her lips moved, I could almost read the words. He's the problem. She didn't know I'd already found the first crack in her paperwork. The officer of rules had submitted the last 3 inspection reports under a contractor named Gulf Shore Maintenance. But when I checked the licensing database, the company didn't exist. A phantom contractor. A false signature. It wasn't negligence, it was cover-up. That evening, the board chair came knocking. I sat down at my workbench, opened my laptop again, and began cross-referencing the HOA's expense reports. There it was, $48,000 paid to Gulf Shore Maintenance over 3 years. But the routing number led to a private account under a name I recognized, Marrow Property Services, LLC. It was her. The tyrant in heels had been using community funds to pad her personal business. And the seawall, the one holding back tons of ocean water, was rotting because of it. The wind outside shifted, and with it came a deep, cracking sound, like a groan from beneath the bluff. I rushed outside and saw it, a thin stream of water bleeding through a fissure in the concrete, running like a silver vein down the wall's surface. She thought I was spreading panic, but panic was about to become her new reality. Tomorrow's HOA meeting wasn't going to be a discussion. It was going to be exposure. The next morning, I walked into the clubhouse knowing exactly what kind of storm I was walking into. Celeste Marrow stood at the far end of the table, her usual throne position, flanked by board members who looked more like loyal jurors than volunteers. Her crimson jacket caught the morning light pouring through the glass walls, glowing like a warning flare. The clipboard queen didn't waste time. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice steady but sharp enough to cut glass, "you've been making alarming claims about our seawall. Before this continues any further, the board would like you to explain yourself, on record." I scanned the room. A dozen homeowners filled the seats behind me, curious, whispering. Their expressions held a mix of concern and fatigue, the same faces I'd seen for years, while the HOA drained their fees into ornamental nonsense. But one person stood out, Hannah Brooks, sitting 3 chairs away from Celeste. She wasn't meeting my eyes. Her hands were clasped so tightly on her lap that her knuckles looked white. I started calmly. "I'm not making claims. I'm presenting facts. The structural stress markers on the east segment are spreading. If we don't relieve the load, the foundation could shear off during the next major tide event." Celeste leaned forward, lips curling in a cold smile. "And you're qualified to make that assessment because—" "I'm a licensed engineer," I said, "and because I helped build that seawall with my father. I know every reinforcement bar inside it." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. The board chair held up her manicured hand to silence them. "Mr. Holloway, with all due respect, your personal history doesn't override the professional inspections this board commissioned." "From a company that doesn't exist," I countered, her head tilted slightly like a snake noticing movement in the grass. "Excuse me?" I stepped closer to the table, sliding a folder across it. Inside were printouts of payment records, routing numbers, and screenshots from the state licensing database. Gulf Shore Maintenance. No registration, no permits, no owner listed. But the routing number on your expense logs connects directly to Marrow Property Services, LLC. For the first time, the enforcer in crimson froze. A sharp intake of breath cut through the room. One of the older board members, Thomas, shifted uneasily. "Celeste, is that true?" Her jaw clenched. "This is irrelevant," she snapped. "This is a smear tactic." Hannah finally looked up. Her voice trembled. "It's not irrelevant if the seawall is compromised. People's homes are at risk." The clipboard queen shot her a glare that could have turned stone to ash. "Hannah, you're out of line." But it was too late. The first crack had formed, not in concrete, but in her command. If you've ever watched power start to crumble, you know it doesn't fall with a crash. It fractures slowly, one truth at a time. I turned to the audience. Last night, a section of the wall started leaking. You can go see it yourselves. It's not speculation anymore. It's erosion. The officer of rules rose from her chair. This meeting is over. I won't have baseless accusations jeopardizing community stability. You mean your reputation? I said quietly. That was when Hannah spoke again, stronger this time. Celeste, you told me Gulf Shore handled the maintenance personally. You said the files were confidential because of insurance liability. Enough! The board chair snapped, slamming her clipboard down. The sharp crack echoed through the hall, making a few people flinch. Every eye was on her now. The polished composure she wore like armor was slipping. She straightened her blazer, forcing a smile. Mr. Holloway, if you continue to disrupt official proceedings, the board will have no choice but to pursue legal action. I stared at her for a long moment. Go ahead. But while you're filing papers, I'll be filing a report. With the Department of Environmental Management. The room erupted in whispers. Celeste's mask finally cracked for real. Her voice dropped low, venomous. You don't know who you're dealing with. Oh, I do, I said. A woman who thought she could outlast the ocean. The tyrant in heels gathered her things and swept out of the room, her heels clicking like warning shots across the tile. Hannah sat frozen, trembling. When the door closed behind Celeste, she whispered, almost to herself, "She lied to all of us." That was the moment I knew. Hannah wasn't just another bystander. She'd been part of it, maybe unknowingly, but her conscience was cracking faster than the seawall. After the meeting, I found her in the parking lot, leaning against her car, shaking. "Hannah," I said softly, "you know something I don't. Don't let her bury you under this." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she whispered, "Meet me tonight, by the old dock." That was the first time I saw guilt turn into courage. By sunset, the storm clouds rolling over the bay matched the tension twisting in my chest. The ocean had turned the color of gunmetal, calm but deceptive. I stood by the old dock, waiting for Hannah, knowing every minute she hesitated was another crack forming somewhere in Celeste Marrow's empire. When she finally appeared, her hair whipped by the wind, she looked smaller than she had in that boardroom. The weight of loyalty and fear hung heavy on her shoulders. She didn't speak at first, just stared out at the seawall in the distance. Even from here, I could see the faint glimmer of water leaking through one of the seams. "She told us it was under control," Hannah said finally, her voice trembling. "That the reports were fine, that the engineers confirmed stability. I never saw any of it myself. She said it was sensitive legal material. The clipboard queen and her secrets. It all fit." I stepped closer, keeping my tone calm. "You've been treasurer for 3 years, right? You must have seen the payments to Gulf Shore maintenance." She nodded. "I did, but she said those were retainer fees for ongoing inspections. She always handled the correspondence herself." Hannah looked at me, guilt carving into her face. I wanted to believe her. She made it sound like we were protecting the neighborhood. But now, her voice cracked. "She used you," I said gently. "She used everyone." The enforcer in crimson had always known how to make obedience look like virtue. That was her gift. She didn't demand power, she convinced people to hand it to her willingly. Hannah rubbed her hands together nervously. "She's already preparing a counterattack. I overheard her on the phone after the meeting. She's contacting the HOA's insurance provider, saying you fabricated the documents. She's trying to get you discredited before you can file that report." Of course she was. The officer of rules never fought fair. She fought strategically. "What did she say exactly?" I asked. "She said, if I go down, so does he. And then..." She laughed. That laugh, I'd heard it before. The same sound she made when she fined a retired veteran for unauthorized flag placement. It wasn't joy, it was dominance. "Then we don't give her the chance," I said. "We go higher." Hannah frowned. "Higher?" "State inspectors, Environmental Hazard Division. They'll take jurisdiction once the public infrastructure's at risk." She hesitated, eyes darting toward the waves. "If I give you access to the board's digital archives, can you prove what she did?" "I don't need to prove it," I said quietly. "I just need to let the evidence speak for itself." Lightning flashed far off the coast. The thunder followed a moment later, rolling like a distant verdict. Hannah flinched. "What if she finds out I helped you?" "She already suspects you," I said. "You stood up in that meeting. You showed more courage in 5 seconds than most people show in a lifetime." Her lips trembled into something between fear and gratitude. "You sound like your father." That caught me off guard. "You knew him?" She nodded. "Everyone did. He built half this town. Even Celeste used to praise him before she changed. Before she learned that fear governed faster than respect." As the rain began to fall, Hannah handed me a small USB drive. "This is everything. Financial logs, email threads, contract requests. Don't tell anyone where you got it." I took it carefully. "You just gave this neighborhood a fighting chance." She shook her head. "I just want to sleep at night again." When she left, I stayed by the dock, staring at the water rippling under the stormlight. Somewhere beneath that surface was the echo of my father's legacy, and the rot Celeste had buried beneath it. I drove home through sheets of rain, my wipers barely keeping up. Every so often, flashes of the seawall lit up in my headlights, each one revealing another leak, another wound. By the time I reached my driveway, my phone buzzed. A new message, unknown number. "You don't know what forces you're playing with." No name, but I didn't need one. Only Celeste Marrow wrote threats like they were policy memos. The tyrant in heels wasn't panicking. She was repositioning. I knew her type too well. She'd rather destroy the evidence than face humiliation. I opened the drive, plugged it into my laptop, and started sorting files. And that's when I found it. An internal memo time-stamped 6 months earlier, addressed to the HOA president and board members. It read, "Seawall integrity confirmed. No risk of breach. Recommend diverting funds from structural to aesthetic improvements. Lighting, fencing, and landscaping, priority high." But the signature line wasn't from a contractor. It was from Celeste herself. She hadn't just covered up the danger. She'd signed her name to the lie. Outside, thunder split the sky again, followed by the deep, hollow sound of something collapsing near the bluff. The ocean had started calling in her debt. By morning, the seawall wasn't just leaking. It was groaning. The sound was faint but distinct, like stone under stress, an old creature waking from years of neglect. I stood by my kitchen window, coffee cooling in my hand, watching the tide push against the barrier as the first orange light broke over the bay. What used to be a scenic view now felt like a countdown. I'd spent half the night going through the data Hannah gave me, and the deeper I went, the worse it got. Celeste Marrow had created an illusion of order while siphoning funds into shell companies. Payments for landscaping assessments, safety audits, even marina beautification. All funneled through her personal network. Every dollar meant to maintain the seawall had gone into keeping her empire polished on the surface, while its foundation rotted underneath. I uploaded the evidence packet and sent it to the state's Environmental Hazard Division. I'd worked with them years ago on flood resilience projects, and I still had a contact, Inspector Wallace. If anyone could make sense of the mess legally and technically, it was him. 2 hours later, I got his reply. "Meet me at the bluff by noon. Bring visual proof. If what you're saying is true, she's in serious violation." The clipboard queen had no idea the state was now involved. I arrived early, camera in hand. The seawall shimmered in the distance, waves slamming harder with each passing hour, cracks webbed across its surface like veins on aging marble. As I filmed, I noticed a detail I hadn't before, a faint vibration in the ground, pulsing in rhythm with the waves. The structure wasn't just failing, it was transferring stress inland. When Wallace arrived, his face went grim fast. "You weren't exaggerating," he muttered, crouching beside the crack. "This whole section's delaminating. See that?" He tapped the concrete edge, and a small chunk fell away, revealing rusted rebar underneath. "She said it was reinforced last spring," I told him. He shook his head. "No chance. This thing hasn't seen maintenance in years." The officer of rules had turned deception into policy, and the wall into a loaded gun pointed at the neighborhood. While Wallace took samples, I spotted a familiar figure across the bluff. Red blazer, sunglasses, Celeste Marrow. She stood near her SUV, arms folded, watching. Even from that distance, I could feel her glare. When I approached, she didn't move. "You really think calling the state changes anything?" she said, voice low but steady. "They won't touch this without HOA authorization." "Funny," I said. "You mean the same HOA you defrauded?" Her smile flickered, brittle but defiant. "Careful, Grant. Words like that can get expensive." "You already spent enough of everyone else's money," I shot back. The enforcer in crimson stepped closer, her perfume sharp under the salty wind. "You don't understand the politics of this place. These people need order, and I provide it. They wouldn't last a week without me keeping things neat and under control." I met her stare. Control isn't order, it's fear in disguise. For a heartbeat, something cracked in her expression, something almost human, but then the mask returned. "You've made a mistake involving the state," she said. "Whatever happens next, it's on you." Before I could answer, she turned and walked back to her car, heels clicking across the damp stone. Wallace watched her leave. "That the infamous board chair?" "Yeah," I said quietly. "That's her." He nodded. "She's in deeper trouble than she realizes. If this wall goes, the whole coastal buffer goes with it, and the property losses will bankrupt the association. A perfect storm, financial, legal, and literal. That night, I set up my drone to capture overnight footage of the seawall. Rain rolled in again, thick and relentless, and I could hear the wind howling through the cracks like a warning whistle. Hannah texted me just before midnight. She called an emergency board meeting tomorrow. No notice to members, just execs. Something's off. I replied, "Record everything." Because I knew what came next. The tyrant in heels wasn't retreating. She was setting up her counterattack. At 1:17 a.m., a loud crash echoed from the direction of the bluff. I ran outside barefoot, rain slicing through the darkness, and saw water spraying high into the air where the concrete had finally split. A section of the wall, 20 feet wide, had caved in, spilling seawater through the gap like a bursting artery. It wasn't total collapse yet, but it was the beginning of one. And tomorrow morning, Celeste Marrow would still try to claim it was under control. By sunrise, the damage was undeniable. What had started as a small breach had widened overnight, eating away at the seawall like a living wound. Chunks of concrete lay scattered along the shore, glistening like broken bones under the pale light. The tide had begun to seep farther inland, creeping across the manicured lawns of Seabrook Estates, the neighborhood Celeste Marrow once called her masterpiece. The HOA emergency meeting began at 9 sharp, inside the glass-walled conference room of the clubhouse that overlooked the bay. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were meeting to discuss the collapse while the view behind them literally showed it happening. Celeste sat at the head of the table, every inch the unflappable leader in her crimson jacket, hair perfectly set, expression calm to the point of arrogance. She tapped her pen rhythmically against her clipboard, an unspoken signal that she still believed she controlled the narrative. "Let's be clear," the board chair began, her tone surgical. "The structural event last night was minor, a temporary breach caused by tidal stress. Maintenance crews are already assessing repairs." I almost laughed. "Minor?" I said, standing from my seat near the back. "That temporary breach washed out a 40-foot section of retaining wall and flooded half of the east lawn." Her head snapped toward me, irritation flickering beneath her polished poise. "You're not a voting member of this session, Mr. Holloway. You'll speak when invited." I took a slow breath. "Funny, you invited the problem when you ignored every warning." A few murmurs stirred among the board members. The enforcer in crimson ignored them and leaned forward. "Grant, this meeting isn't about blame. It's about solutions. Emotional reactions don't solve infrastructure failures." "Neither does embezzlement," I said. The room went silent. Her pen stopped tapping. "Careful," she said softly. "That's a dangerous accusation." I stepped closer to the glass window, pointing toward the distant seawall where the waves kept hammering the break. "You want evidence? Look out there. That's years of negligence, falsified reports, and diverted funds. You signed every one of those inspection statements yourself." The clipboard queen's smile tightened. "You have no proof." "Wrong again," I said, pulling a tablet from my bag. "I sent everything to the state. The inspection team is already en route, and when they arrive, they'll find more than a collapse. They'll find a cover-up." The tyrant in heels rose from her chair so abruptly that her coffee spilled. "You think you're saving this community? You're destroying it. Property values will tank. Insurance premiums will spike. Our residents will lose everything because of your little crusade." Her voice cracked just enough to show it wasn't outrage. It was fear. "That wall was never just concrete," I said quietly. "It was a promise, one my father made when he built it, and one you broke when you turned safety into profit." The officer of rules glared at me, eyes narrowing to slits. You sentimentalize everything. You think legacy wins against reality? Wake up, Grant. This is business. Nobody cares about promises anymore. I stared at her for a long moment. You will when the bay comes through your front door. For the first time, the crowd murmured in my favor. One elderly resident stood up. He's right. My backyard's underwater already. We trusted you, Celeste. Another voice chimed in. I lost power last night because the pump house flooded. The board chair's composure fractured. She slammed her clipboard down, eyes flashing. Enough! I said it's under control. But it wasn't, and everyone in that room knew it. Hannah entered suddenly, out of breath. Grant, she said, voice shaking, you need to see this, now. She handed me her phone. On screen was a live video feed from a local news drone. The seawall, what was left of it, was now collapsing in real time. The video panned to reveal a massive whirlpool forming near the residential edge, pulling in debris, soil, even part of the walkway. Celeste snatched the phone, eyes wide. For once, she didn't speak. The enforcer in crimson turned slowly toward the window. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance as residents gathered on the shoreline, shouting, pointing, filming. This is your minor event, I said. Her lips trembled. We can fix it. But the ground trembled, and a low guttural sound rolled through the earth like thunder from below. The wall gave way with a deafening crack, and a wall of water surged inland, swallowing the lower edge of the golf course in seconds. People screamed, chairs toppled, and Celeste, Marrow, the woman who once commanded an entire neighborhood through fear, stumbled backward, pale and shaking, clutching the table to keep from falling. In that instant, every illusion she'd built finally broke, and the ocean took back what was always its own. The roar of collapsing stones still echoed through my head long after the water settled. By the time emergency crews arrived, the lower half of Seabrook Estates looked like a drowned city, lawns turned to mud, fences ripped from the ground, streetlights flickering underwater. The seawall, once Celeste Marrow's pride, was nothing but fractured slabs jutting out of the bay like the ribs of a corpse. I stood near the shoreline, drenched to the bone, while the clipboard queen barked orders at first responders as if she still had authority. Her crimson blazer was smeared with dirt, her once perfect hair plastered to her face. Even now, she tried to command control from chaos. Block off the east road. Call the maintenance supervisor. Now. The officer of rules had built her empire on polished optics. But now, standing knee-deep in sludge, she looked exactly like what she'd always been. A woman desperately trying to bury her guilt beneath command. Hannah found me near the edge of the property line. Her face was pale, her phone trembling in her hand. Grant, she's deleting the records. What? She's using the backup access? Remember the one only the board president has? She's erasing every file from the HOA drive. Financials, permits, contracts, all of it. Of course she was. The tyrant in heels wasn't just trying to save herself. She was trying to rewrite history before the state inspectors arrived. I took her phone and scrolled through the security feed. There she was, in the HOA office alone, typing furiously, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of the monitor. The enforcer in crimson looked frantic now, pacing, muttering, her hand shaking as she clicked through the database. Hannah looked at me. If she wipes those files, everything you gathered could be dismissed as unverified. They'll say it's circumstantial. Not if I stopped her first. I ran through the soaked streets toward the office, mud splattering against my boots. The wind howled, carrying the sharp scent of salt and concrete dust. The power grid had gone unstable. Streetlights flickered in and out, as if the neighborhood itself couldn't decide whether to live or die. When I burst through the glass doors of the HOA building, Celeste looked up sharply. Her mascara had run, but her defiance hadn't. "You're trespassing," she hissed. "You're destroying evidence," I said. Her eyes flicked toward the monitor. "There is no evidence," she said. "There's only your story, and my reputation. Guess which one survives?" I stepped closer. "You still think this is about power. It's not. It's about accountability." She laughed, a brittle, broken sound. "Accountability? You think anyone out there cares who's responsible? They just want someone to blame, and I refuse to be the sacrifice." "You already are," I said. For a moment she faltered. Behind the arrogance, I saw the truth, fear, raw and unfiltered. The same woman who had humiliated homeowners, fined veterans, and silenced dissent was finally standing on sinking ground. "You don't understand what I've built," she said softly. "Without me, this place falls apart." "It's already fallen apart," I replied. "You just can't admit it." She reached for the keyboard again, but before she could type another command, the power cut out completely. The monitors went black. The hum of electronics died, replaced by the sound of rain pelting the windows. In the dark, I heard her whisper, "What have you done?" "Nothing," I said. "That's the city cutting power to prevent electrical fires." She backed away slowly. "You think this redeems you, don't you? That destroying me fixes what's broken here." "No," I said quietly, "but it stops it from spreading." At that moment, Hannah rushed in holding a flashlight. "Grant, the inspectors are here, and the media. They're asking for you." Celeste froze. "Media?" Hannah nodded grimly. "Local stations? Someone uploaded the collapse footage to social media. It's everywhere. As a Seabrook flood is trending." For the first time, the enforcer in crimson looked truly defeated. Her shoulders sagged, her eyes darting between me and the window, where flashing lights from news vans reflected against the wet glass. I turned to her. "This isn't the end for you, but it's the truth catching up." She stared at me for a long, trembling moment before whispering, "You'll regret this." "Maybe," I said, "but I'll never regret warning you." When I stepped outside, the air felt heavier but cleaner. Reporters swarmed the area, lights glaring, microphones raised. Residents gathered behind barricades, their faces a mixture of awe, grief, and anger. Hannah stood beside me, silent but resolute. A news reporter shouted, "Mr. Holloway, is it true the HOA ignored your warnings?" I looked at the wreckage, then back at the crowd. "They didn't just ignore them," I said. "They mocked them. And now the ocean's done what I couldn't. It's reminded them that arrogance has consequences." Behind me, through the broken glass, I saw Celeste Marrow sink into a chair, motionless, silent, and small. The clipboard queen of Seabrook Estates had finally run out of rules to hide behind. The morning after the collapse, Seabrook Estates didn't look like a neighborhood. It looked like a war zone. Fences torn apart, driveways cracked open, saltwater puddles reflecting the pale, clouded sky. The Seawall failure had turned the once pristine waterfront into a graveyard of luxury. And right at the center of it all stood Celeste Marrow, the self-proclaimed savior of Seabrook, trying to hold press conferences on a patch of dry ground that barely existed anymore. She wore the same crimson blazer from yesterday, though now it was water-stained and streaked with mud. The enforcer in crimson faced the cameras like a politician cornered by truth. "The situation is under review," she said, forcing composure through gritted teeth. "We've coordinated with city engineers to assess next steps. We urge residents to remain calm. This was a natural event, not a management failure. A natural event." The words rolled off her tongue like a rehearsed defense. But even the reporters seemed unconvinced. Standing beside Hannah, I watched from a distance as the clipboard queen delivered her damage control speech. She spoke about resilience, about rebuilding, about the spirit of the Seabrook community. But the way her voice wavered at the edges told another story. A woman frantically trying to keep her empire from collapsing along with the concrete. "Grant," Hannah murmured, "she's still trying to spin it. Half the residents are blaming the city now." I nodded slowly. Then, it's time they saw what really caused this. Overnight, I'd compiled the video footage from my drone, the seismic data from the bluff sensors, and the state inspection notes Wallace forwarded. Together, they formed a narrative that was impossible to deny. A visual timeline proving the seawall collapse was entirely preventable. Neglected maintenance, falsified safety certifications, misallocated repair funds. Every lie she'd built her reputation on was about to turn against her. I uploaded the file to a shared drive and sent it to 3 places simultaneously: the Seabrook Community Forum, the local news station, and the Environmental Hazard Division. Within minutes, notifications began pinging my phone. "Views climbing," Hannah whispered, watching the screen. "Thousands already." By the time Celeste finished her press statement, murmurs were spreading through the crowd. A reporter's phone buzzed, and suddenly his face changed. He turned to her and said sharply, "Ms. Marrow, can you comment on the drone footage circulating online showing falsified reports under your signature?" The tyrant in heels froze. "What footage?" Another reporter joined in. "We have time-stamped video from your office computer last night. It appears you attempted to delete financial files moments before power was cut. Can you explain that?" Her mask began to crack. "That's absurd," she snapped. "Those videos are fabricated." But the evidence was already playing on someone's phone nearby, visible to every bystander watching. Her voice filled the air in a recorded clip. "Erase everything. Nobody needs to see this." The officer of rules stumbled backward, eyes darting as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. "This is out of context," she shouted, but no one was listening anymore. The cameras turned, the whispers grew louder, and residents who had once feared her now glared with open contempt. Hannah leaned closer to me. "You just ended her career." I didn't answer, because deep down, I knew this wasn't about careers. It was about accountability that had been buried for years under HOA bureaucracy and false charm. Within an hour, state officials arrived again, this time not as observers, but as investigators. Inspector Wallace approached me. "We've reviewed the footage," he said. "You did the right thing. She'll face charges for falsification of safety documents and obstruction." I looked past him toward the board chair, who now stood surrounded by officers, her once authoritative gestures replaced by desperate pleas. "I built this place," she cried. "You can't just take it from me." Wallace shook his head. "You didn't build it, ma'am. You compromised it." The scene drew nearly every resident out of their homes. Some shouted, others recorded. A few simply stared in disbelief. The HOA that once ruled them with fines and threats had just been stripped of its power in front of the whole community. Later that afternoon, Hannah and I walked to the edge of the collapsed seawall. The water had receded slightly, leaving behind a jagged boundary between destruction and survival. "You really think this fixes things?" she asked quietly. "No," I said, "but it's the start of something better." Behind us, emergency trucks rolled in, hauling sandbags and pumps. The sound of hammers echoed faintly as residents, freed from Celeste's grip, started helping one another for the first time in years. And as I looked across the bay, I realized something. The collapse hadn't just exposed a structural flaw, it had revealed a moral one. The entire community had been drowning long before the seawall gave way. They just didn't see it until the water reached their doorsteps. As for Celeste Marrow, her voice still carried faintly across the wind, arguing with officers, denying everything. But it no longer mattered. The ocean had spoken louder. By evening, Seabrook Estates felt like a place caught between judgment and redemption. The air smelled of salt and concrete dust. The bay glimmered with a deceptive calm, as if the ocean itself were satisfied after reclaiming what had been stolen. But beneath that stillness, chaos simmered. Reporters, residents, investigators, and contractors all swarming what used to be one of the most prestigious coastal communities in the state. And right in the center of it all, Celeste Marrow was unraveling. The once impenetrable board chair stood near the ruins of the clubhouse, wrapped in a raincoat far too thin for the cold, her phone pressed against her ear. The enforcer in crimson was no longer speaking to the media. She was pleading. "No, listen," she snapped at whoever was on the other end. "This isn't on me. The council signed off. On the budget, I was following procedure." She paced in circles, boots splashing through muddy puddles, trying to project control, but radiating panic. "You can't just abandon me now. I have—" She stopped mid-sentence when she noticed the camera crews slowly shifting their lenses toward her again. Instantly, she straightened her posture, forced that politician's smile back onto her face, and muttered, "No comment," before storming off toward the office ruins. I watched her from the edge of the flooded path. My gut twisted, not with pity. That emotion had long burned away, but with an eerie recognition. She'd built her identity entirely on control. Now that it was gone, she was hollow. Hannah approached beside me, arms crossed. "The insurance reps are here," she said quietly. "They're not covering the damages." I turned. "What?" "They found discrepancies in the HOA's safety audit reports," she continued. "The ones Celeste signed off on. They're calling it gross negligence. Every homeowner's claim just got frozen." That hit me harder than I expected. "So the residents lose everything because of her?" Hannah shook her head. Not if they fight together. A class action's already forming, but they're scared. They don't trust anyone anymore. I glanced back at the clipboard queen, who was now frantically rifling through a box of salvage papers inside the broken clubhouse. Her reflection flickered in the shattered window, a woman clawing through the debris of her own empire. It was time to turn the tide completely. That night, I called a meeting. Not in the HOA hall, that was still cordoned off, but in the open field overlooking the damaged seawall. Lanterns glowed across the grass, illuminating faces that looked weary, angry, but ready. "Let's not pretend this place was ever perfect," I began. "You all know what we lived under. Fines for grass height, threats for paint colors, surveillance disguised as security. But this..." I gestured toward the dark line of the collapsed wall. "This is what happens when control replaces community." The crowd murmured. I saw neighbors who hadn't spoken in years standing side by side. A former board member, eyes red-rimmed, whispered, "We all knew. We just didn't think it would end like this." I nodded. "It doesn't have to end, but we need to rebuild differently. No more closed-door votes, no more unchecked power. We form a new committee, transparent, resident-led, and accountable." A few hesitant claps echoed through the field. Then, slowly, it spread. Applause swelling like a wave rolling through the crowd. Just as hope began to flicker, a sharp voice cut through the air. "You think you can lead them?" Celeste stood behind the fence line, mud streaked across her face, her once sleek jacket torn. The tyrant in heels had become the ghost of her own authority. "You don't understand what leadership means," she spat. "You're a contractor, not a statesman. These people need order, not your bleeding heart rebellion." I stepped forward, meeting her gaze. "No, Celeste. They need trust, and that's something you never built." Her laugh was hollow. "Trust doesn't keep seawalls standing." "Neither did you," I said. The crowd fell silent as she froze, realizing every camera, every phone, every eye was on her again. For the first time, she looked small. "You'll regret this," she whispered, though her voice cracked halfway through. I didn't respond. She turned away, stumbling through the mud, her reflection swallowed by the shadows beyond the floodlights. Hannah exhaled softly beside me. That felt final. "Not yet," I said. "But it will be." We stayed there long after the crowd dispersed. The wind carried the faint sound of waves against the shore, steady, rhythmic, almost peaceful. The seawall may have fallen, but the truth had held. And in that fragile quiet, Seabrook Estates began to breathe again. By dawn, Seabrook Estates was divided cleanly in two, the hopeful and the haunted. Half the residents had joined the rebuilding effort, sandbagging driveways, draining basements, and clearing wreckage from the parkway. The other half stayed behind their curtains, still afraid of what came next, of what it meant to live without the iron order that Celeste Marrow had imposed for nearly a decade. I didn't blame them. Change always starts as chaos. And for people who had lived under her shadow for so long, freedom probably felt dangerous. When I arrived at the temporary operations tent, set up near the old clubhouse ruins, Hannah was already there, hunched over her laptop. "You'll want to see this," she said, her voice clipped. The screen showed a forwarded email thread, leaked directly from the state's environmental division. Attached were 3 inspection reports, all falsified under the same electronic signature, Celeste Marrow's. She'd submitted fake structural stability data after the first seawall inspection 2 years ago. "She forged these?" I asked quietly. "Every line," Hannah replied. "Even copied signatures from old reports. The system caught duplicates when the investigators cross-referenced dates. It's game over for her." But I wasn't celebrating, because as I scrolled further down, I saw something worse, a transfer authorization. Celeste had rerouted HOA emergency maintenance funds to a private account under a shell property management company. Over $200,000. That money should have gone toward reinforcement of the Seawall's retaining section. Instead, it disappeared into her private real estate venture. The clipboard queen hadn't just ignored the danger. She'd profited from it. Before I could say anything, Hannah's phone buzzed. "She's called a meeting," she said. "Who?" "Celeste, at the East. The cul-de-sac. Says she's addressing the future of Seabrook." Of course she was. The tyrant in heels wasn't done yet. Even cornered, she couldn't resist one last performance. When we arrived, half the neighborhood had gathered. Celeste stood on the bed of a pickup truck like a politician without a podium. Her once perfect crimson jacket had been replaced by a trench coat, but she still wore her board pin, tarnished but proudly displayed. "Neighbors," she began, raising her voice over the wind, "what happened to our community was a tragedy, but not one caused by malice. The seawall was old, neglectful city funding delayed repairs, the media twisted facts, and outside contractors," she shot me a glare, "exploited panic for attention." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. She was rewriting reality again, but fewer people seemed convinced this time. I stepped forward. "You really want to stand here and lie again?" Her eyes narrowed. "I'm reminding people that Seabrook still stands, Mr. Holloway. You're the one who seems eager to burn it down." "Seabrook fell the moment you made it about your power," I said evenly. "And now everyone knows where that money went." The officer of rules blinked, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through her defiance. "What are you talking about?" I turned to Hannah, who held up a printed document. "State investigators traced the missing maintenance funds," I announced. "They were redirected to a company registered under your name, Celeste. I'm sure you know it, Marrow Coastal Holdings." Her face drained of color. Hannah continued. "The funds were used to purchase private property just outside city zoning, land that, ironically, remained dry while the seawall failed." A low gasp spread through the crowd. Residents began pulling out phones, recording everything. Celeste stammered, "Those were board-approved transfers, emergency funds for personal profit," I cut in. "You used the community's trust to build your own lifeboat." She took a trembling step forward. "You don't understand." "No, Celeste," I said. "For once, everyone does." The tension snapped like a cable under strain. The crowd erupted. Shouts, accusations, betrayal spilling out all at once. "You stole from us. You ruined our homes. You lied to our faces." For the first time, the enforcer in crimson had no comeback. Her hand shook as she tried to hold her ground, her voice drowned by the sound of the very people she once ruled. State officials arrived minutes later, flashing badges. One approached her with a folder. "Celeste Marrow, we need you to come with us. You're under investigation for fraud and endangerment." She looked around wildly, searching for an ally, but found none. Even the former board members stood still, refusing to defend her. "I did this for Seabrook," she shouted as they led her away. "Everything I did was for this community." I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "No, Celeste. You did it for yourself. Seabrook just paid the price." Her eyes flickered with something between fury and sorrow, but it was too late. The clipboard queen had finally lost her throne. As the police cruiser doors shut, I turned back to the residence. The rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low, heavy, expectant. Hannah whispered beside me, "It's over." I looked toward the broken seawall, the jagged edge glinting under the morning light. "No," I said quietly. "Now it finally begins." By the time the community gathered that night, the air was heavy with something more powerful than anger, vindication. The floodlights cast long reflections across the cracked pavement, shimmering against the still water that lapped near the ruined clubhouse steps. It wasn't just another HOA meeting anymore. It was the reckoning. Celeste Marrow stood before the residents of Seabrook Estates like a dethroned monarch summoned before her people. Her red jacket was gone. Now, in a dark overcoat and trembling hands, she looked more defendant than leader. Yet, even stripped of authority, the board chair tried to command the room. "This is a misunderstanding," she began, her voice sharp but wavering. "There are procedures, appeals, that protect board members from witch hunts like this." Someone from the crowd shouted, "You lied to us, Celeste!" Another voice joined, "You stole from the fund that was supposed to save our homes." She flinched but tried to recover her composure. "We all make decisions under pressure. I did what was best for Seabrook." I stepped closer, microphone in hand. The news crews had come at my invitation this time. Live coverage, spotlights cutting through the damp air. "You called it leadership," I said, my voice steady. "But leadership isn't hiding evidence, falsifying reports, or diverting funds into shell companies. That's theft." The crowd stirred again, murmurs rising like a tide. The enforcer in crimson scanned the faces before her, but no one met her gaze with sympathy. Even the conflicted witness, Wallace, the city inspector, who had once bent to her authority, stood silently among the crowd, arms folded. I never falsified anything, she said quickly, eyes darting toward him. You know I didn't. Wallace shook his head. I saw the signed statements, Celeste, and I saw you edit them. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Her jaw tightened, eyes glossing over. You don't understand how much I sacrificed, she whispered. Every complaint, every meeting, every angry neighbor, I was the one keeping this place alive. Alive? I stepped forward again. You kept it under fear. You fined veterans for flagpoles, threatened families over fences, silenced dissent with legal threats. You didn't lead, Celeste. You ruled. The tyrant in heels clenched her fists. You think you're any different, Holloway? You think these people will follow you once the cameras leave? I smiled faintly. I'm not asking them to follow me. I'm asking them to finally follow their conscience. The murmur turned into applause, hesitant at first, then stronger. Hannah stood near the front, her eyes locked on me, nodding. The sound seemed to break something in Celeste. She laughed bitterly. You think this ends with me? You think you've won? The HOA charter still exists. The bylaws still give authority to the board. You'll see. They'll come crawling back to order when this chaos eats them alive. Maybe, I said softly, but at least that order won't be built on fear anymore. A state official moved toward her. Ms. Marrow, we're serving you with an injunction pending a full audit. You are hereby removed from your position as board chair, effective immediately. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought she might faint. You can't... But the clipboard queen's protest was drowned out by the cheers of the residents. For the first time in years, Seabrook Estates erupted, not in outrage, but in release. I turned to the crowd. We rebuild together. No more closed-door meetings. No more selective enforcement. Every decision from this day forward, public, transparent, and accountable. Hannah added, we're registering as a nonprofit association, not a private council. Every homeowner gets a voice. The applause swelled again, and under the floodlights, faces that once looked weary now glowed with something close to hope. Even Wallace, the conflicted witness, raised his hand in quiet agreement. Celeste stood motionless at the edge of it all, her reflection trembling in the water pooled beneath her feet. You're all fools, she hissed. This place will rot without me. I met her gaze one last time. No, Celeste. It's already starting to heal. As the officials led her away, a gust of wind rolled off the bay, scattering the last remnants of her paperwork. Pages of bylaws, budgets, and violation notices fluttering into the dark water. It felt poetic, almost biblical, and in that moment, the tyranny that once ruled Seabrook dissolved into the night. The crowd stood in silence, watching as the last of her shadow disappeared into the flashing lights beyond the cul-de-sac. When the noise faded, Hannah stepped beside me. What now? She asked quietly. Now, I said, glancing toward the broken seawall that shimmered in the moonlight. We start rebuilding something that lasts. A pause then, smiling faintly, she said, From the ground up? From the heart out, I replied. The residents began to drift home, lanterns flickering along the street. For the first time since the flood, Seabrook didn't feel broken anymore. It felt alive, and somewhere in the distance, the sea whispered back its approval. Morning broke soft over Seabrook. Estates. For the first time in months, the tide lapped gently against the repaired shoreline, not roaring in defiance. The storm barriers glinted under the pale gold sun. My design, my calculations, my redemption finally standing tall. And for the first time since the collapse, I didn't feel like I was fighting the ocean anymore. The neighborhood was alive again. Children's bikes leaned against fences that had once been marked for violation. Neighbors who used to whisper behind curtains now stood side by side, planting trees where water had once claimed their lawns. You could almost feel Seabrook breathing, not in fear, but in relief. Still, the memory of Celeste Marrow lingered like a shadow at the edge of that peace. The board chair's name had been scrubbed from the community directory, her office emptied, her signature struck from every document, yet, even erased, she haunted the place. A reminder of what happens when power turns inward. I walked past the site of the old clubhouse, now flattened to a concrete foundation, where the enforcer in crimson had once ruled every meeting with her raised hand and clipped tone. The same ground that had trembled beneath her authority now stood bare and open to light. Hannah joined me, her jacket zipped against the sea breeze. "Feels different, doesn't it?" she said. "Lighter," I answered, like the air doesn't belong to her anymore. She smiled faintly. "The new committee meets tonight. You're on the list." I said I'd help, not lead. "I know, but people listen to you now, Grant." I shook my head with a small laugh. "They're just glad someone finally stood up to the tyrant in heels." "Still," she said, looking at me sideways, "don't pretend you didn't enjoy watching her empire crack." I paused, eyes tracing the horizon where sunlight kissed the repaired seawall. Enjoy? Maybe not. But it felt right. There was silence for a beat. Just wind and the sound of waves brushing the rocks. Rhythmic, steady, almost cleansing. "Do you think she'll go to prison?" Hannah asked. I exhaled slowly. "Fraud, negligence, falsification. Yeah, but that's not what will break her." "Then what will?" "Silence," I said quietly. "People like Celeste don't survive without an audience." Later that evening, as lanterns flickered across the cul-de-sac, the new board met under a tent. No formal dais, no titles, no crimson jackets. Just folding chairs and a whiteboard with handwritten agendas. The officer of rules had been replaced by a circle of equals. I stood at the edge, listening as residents spoke, freely, nervously, honestly. A retired teacher suggested transparent budgets. A single mother proposed a neighborhood watch system. Wallace, the former inspector, volunteered to oversee structural audits. Hannah took notes, smiling every so often at the awkward sincerity of it all. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was real. Then one of the neighbors turned to me. "Grant," she said, "you started all this. Say something." For a moment I hesitated. The lights flickered gently, the sea murmuring behind us. "All I did," I said, "was refuse to look away. When power goes unchecked, it eats everything. Our homes, our safety, our trust. Celeste taught us that, but she also gave us the blueprint for what not to become." Someone murmured, "So what do we become instead?" I smiled. "Neighbors again?" Applause rippled through the crowd, small but genuine. Not the kind that celebrated a victory, but the kind that honored survival. As the meeting ended, I lingered behind. The night air carried a faint hum of the ocean, mingled with laughter from across the street. I picked up a discarded piece of driftwood and carved a quick line into it with my pocket knife. Just one word: Seabrook. I planted it in the sand near the rebuilt seawall, a small marker for the place that refused to drown. Behind me, Hannah called out, "You're going to make that a tradition, aren't you?" "Maybe," I said, "something to remind us that what's built on truth stays standing." She joined me by the water's edge. You think she ever understood that? I thought of the clipboard queen, sitting somewhere behind glass walls, replaying her downfall like a courtroom echo. "No," I said finally, "but maybe that's the point. Some people have to sink so the rest can learn to swim." We stood there in silence, the waves glowing faintly under the moonlight. The sea had taken its due, the walls had been rebuilt, and for the first time since it began, Seabrook's reflection on the water wasn't one of ruin. It was of resilience. If you've ever stood your ground against arrogance and won, you know exactly how this feels. And if you haven't yet, stay. Hit the subscribe button right now, share your stories in the comments, and tell me where are you watching from, because the next wave is yours.